There's something happening in football right now that could create a real headache for the Seahawks, and it's one of those situations that might not look like a huge deal at first. But once you understand how this new rule can affect roster depth, the practice squad, and even some of the decisions Seattle has to make, it starts to feel a lot more serious. So stick with me, because this could have consequences that Seahawks fans definitely need to know about. If you're ready for the season, hit that like button and drop "Go Hawks" in the comments. A new college football eligibility development could create an unexpected problem for the Seattle Seahawks, and the concern goes much deeper than whether one fringe running back makes the final roster. A judge in Louisiana has granted a group that includes 16 football players the ability to return to college sports, enter the transfer portal, and potentially join a new school. Several of those players have been in NFL training camps, and this situation directly touches Seattle because one of them is currently with the Seahawks, while another was recently on the roster. The two names Seahawks fans need to know are Anthony Hankerson and T.J. Harden. Harden was with Seattle and played in the team's most recent preseason game. He even recovered a fumble on special teams, according to the account in the report. Seattle later released him, and now Harden has entered the college football transfer portal. This isn't some theoretical possibility that might eventually affect an NFL player. In Harden's case, the move back toward college football is already happening. Hankerson makes this even more important for Seattle, because he is currently on the Seahawks roster. The possibility raised by this situation is that if Hankerson realizes he probably isn't going to survive the final roster decisions, returning to college could become an alternative instead of remaining available to Seattle as a potential practice squad player. That's where this becomes complicated. The eligibility change at the center of the situation gives players 5 years of eligibility to play college football. Previously, the basic structure was essentially 4 playing years, with circumstances such as a redshirt season, and in some cases, a medical redshirt, allowing a player to spend additional years in college without using another season of playing eligibility. Under this new model, players can theoretically play 5 seasons of college sports. That creates an opening for players who previously played 4 years and then entered professional football. If one of those players reaches an NFL training camp and sees that his chances of sticking on the roster are limited, he could look at that remaining college eligibility and decide there is another path available. Instead of accepting an NFL release and hoping for a practice squad opportunity, that player could potentially return to college, play another season, and then try to reach the NFL again. The NCAA had attempted to prevent that possibility, but the latest ruling has opened the door for these players. The report also says players currently on NFL rosters have expressed interest in being released from their contracts. According to the information presented, NFL teams that release eligible players by September 1st would allow those players to join a college football roster under the temporary restraining order. Think about what that means from Seattle's perspective. This isn't primarily about losing a starting running back. It's about potentially losing access to players the Seahawks could otherwise develop, retain on the practice squad, use on special teams, or call up when injuries create a need during the season. T.J. Harden is already an example of the immediate effect. He was available to Seattle during the preseason, Seattle released him, and he entered the transfer portal. Anthony Hankerson could potentially face a similar decision if he doesn't believe he is going to make the Seahawks team. And dismissing those players simply because they aren't guaranteed roster spots misses the concern being raised here. Seattle may need exactly this type of player later. The example presented from last season was Seattle's need for running back depth when injuries forced the team to reach deeper into its options. Velus Jones Jr. and Cam Akers were cited as players who became important when injuries required Seattle to put additional running backs on the field. A player who begins as the third or fourth option can suddenly become necessary. Practice squad running backs can also be elevated when injuries occur and contribute on special teams. That's why losing a player to college football can matter, even if that player wasn't going to be one of the most prominent names on the initial roster. Seattle has decisions to make in a backfield where the expectation discussed in the report is that the Seahawks will keep at least one fullback and potentially 3 or 4 running backs. Zach Charbonnet is also mentioned as part of the equation. Those numbers make the competition difficult for someone like Hankerson, but being outside the initial group doesn't mean a player has no value to the organization. Hankerson's college production is part of the reason this situation deserves attention. At Oregon State, he recorded more than 1,000 rushing yards in only 12 games and averaged approximately 4 yards per rush. The argument isn't that those numbers guarantee him an NFL roster spot. They don't. The point is that he has shown he can play football, and Seattle could have reason to keep developing him if he doesn't initially make the active roster. Maybe that development happens on the practice squad. Maybe injuries eventually create an opportunity. Maybe his ability gives Seattle another option during a long season. None of those outcomes are guaranteed, but those are precisely the possibilities that roster depth is designed to preserve. This new path back to college could remove that possibility before Seattle gets the opportunity to find out. There's another layer to the problem: preseason roster management. Power Echols was used as an example of how Seattle has repeatedly moved players off the roster and brought them back during the preseason. Teams sometimes simply need players who can take repetitions. Those players can help get the team through practices and preseason games, and occasionally, someone who initially appears to be there for depth does enough to earn a longer opportunity. That doesn't mean Hankerson is suddenly expected to jump everyone ahead of him. In fact, the report explicitly rejects the idea that Hankerson is going to beat out Jacardia Wright. The concern is different. It's about preserving the depth behind the players who are expected to make the team. Now Seattle potentially has to consider something it wouldn't ordinarily have to address with a player in Hankerson's position. Does he even want to stay? If Hankerson looks at the running back room and concludes that he probably won't make the roster, returning to college could be more appealing than waiting to see whether Seattle offers him a practice squad position. And if he decides to leave, Seattle has another problem to solve. The Seahawks could need to find another running back simply to replace the depth they lost. That means time and attention being directed toward an issue created by this unusual eligibility situation when Seattle already has other roster business to handle. The report specifically mentions the need to continue developing the current players and potentially making sure Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins is officially signed. Instead, another running back search could suddenly become part of the workload. And this is why the impact shouldn't be measured only by asking whether T.J. Harden or Anthony Hankerson was going to become a major player immediately. NFL rosters aren't built only around the obvious starters. The edges of the roster matter. Practice squads matter. Special teams matter. Having someone already inside the building who understands what the team is doing can matter when an injury suddenly changes the depth chart. The Seahawks have already seen Harden leave their roster and enter the transfer portal. Hankerson remains with them, meaning his situation is the one to watch now. Nothing in the information guarantees that he will leave Seattle, but the option exists. And that option changes the decision facing a player fighting for one of the final places in an NFL organization. So what do you think, Seahawks fans? Is this new path back to college genuinely hurting Seattle's ability to build valuable depth? And what would you want the Seahawks to do about the Anthony Hankerson situation? If you don't want to miss any of the latest Seahawks news and updates, make sure you subscribe to the channel and leave a like on this video. And before you go, click the video that's on your screen right now because there's more Seahawks news you need to know. The latest updates, as soon as they happen, you'll find them right here.